Tonight, as you know, the Supreme Court reminded the country that even the most powerful president in the world does not get to rewrite the Constitution to win an argument about economics. Tonight, Donald Trump lost, and he lost decisively on one of the defining policies of his political identity: tariffs. For years, Trump has described tariffs as economic magic, a way to punish foreign countries, enrich Americans, and fund the U.S. government all at once. He has insisted that other nations were paying us billions. Actually, he said billions and billions in his word, holding tariffs up as proof not just of policy success, but of personal strength. Today, the Supreme Court rejected the legal foundation behind key parts of that strategy. In plain English, a president cannot simply declare an economic emergency and impose sweeping tariffs on imports whenever he chooses. The court said there are constitutional limits, even for a president who's long argued that there should be none. Trump's response was immediate and swift, and as expected, defiant. Here's a portion of what he said today in the White House briefing room.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court. The Democrats on the court are thrilled, but they will automatically vote no. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices. They're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats. They're very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would ever think.
Unpatriotic. Trump said he's got a backup plan, by the way. He claimed this ruling doesn't affect his tariffs, and he can make even bigger tariffs, something we'll discuss over the course of the next hour. And that may be the most revealing part of the day, because this was never only about trade. It was about power. Whether a president can bend law to his will when Congress refuses to cooperate. So let's be clear about what these tariffs actually were. They were not tariffs that were debated and enacted by Congress, which is the way it's supposed to work. The Wall Street Journal explains it this way, quote, "The case involved two categories of tariffs. Trump imposed one category on virtually every country in the world, ostensibly to repair trade deficits. He imposed the other set of tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, saying those countries are responsible for the flow of illegal fentanyl into the United States. Many were imposed using emergency or national security authorities, laws that were written for narrow cases and then expanded to cover everyday goods, steel, aluminum, consumer products, even automobiles. Economically, they functioned exactly like taxes. And despite years of political messaging to the contrary, economists across the ideological spectrum agree on one simple fact: Americans paid them. When goods entered United States ports, American importers paid tariffs to the U.S. government. Businesses then absorbed the cost through lower margins, or they passed on higher prices. Either way, the burden landed here at home, which brings us to a contradiction that today's ruling makes impossible to ignore. Donald Trump has claimed that tariffs generated enormous revenue for America, far beyond independent estimates, while at the same time insisting that there isn't enough money available to refund businesses if courts ruled the tariffs unlawful, as they did today. Both of those things cannot be true. Either tariffs produced massive windfalls, or the money was never what he claimed it was. The court's decision forces that reality into the open, and now comes the question that millions of Americans may reasonably ask tonight: who gets paid back? If you bought a car last year and you paid $1,000 more because tariffs had pushed the prices higher, do you get a refund? Probably not. Refunds, if ordered, go to the companies first that paid tariffs at the border, the importers, the manufacturers, the distributors. Whether consumers ever see that money depends on lawsuits, contracts, and competition. Donald Trump said today the litigation this ruling is likely to create could take years. Again, we'll have our experts react to that as well. Economics moves forward quickly. It almost never rewinds. And after years of disruption justified in the name of reshaping global trade, you may ask, what was the measurable result? The U.S. trade deficit, which Trump carries on all the time, improved last year by roughly $2 billion. $2 billion. It's a $30 trillion economy. $2 billion is not transformation. It is statistical noise achieved at enormous economic and political cost. And states absorbed much of that cost. Farmers faced retaliatory tariffs abroad. Manufacturers paid more for materials at home. Port economies endured instability as supply chains lurched from policy to policy. And now states and businesses confront uncertainty again, as courts now try to sort out refunds and companies adjust for the second time in just a few years. So, yes, this was a trade ruling, but it is actually a constitutional moment. Because tariffs are not just trade tools, they are taxes, and the Constitution is explicit about who controls taxation. Congress, not the president. And this case ultimately asked a question larger than tariffs themselves, whether political ambition can expand presidential authority beyond what the Constitution of the United States permits, whether power can be claimed first and justified later. Today, the Supreme Court answered that question. Today, the Chief Justice of the United States said so plainly, writing for the court, John Roberts reminded the country that, quote, the framers did not vest any part of the taxing power in the executive branch, end quote. That sentence reaches far beyond tariffs. It reaches back to the founding principle that concentrated power, especially economic power, is the very thing that the Constitution was designed to prevent. Donald Trump made tariffs a political symbol. He promised they would remake global trade. They would generate vast wealth. They would come at no cost to Americans. Today, the Supreme Court says the Constitution still sets the rules. The Chief Justice chose the Constitution over Donald Trump. And at a moment when many Americans wonder whether democratic institutions still have the strength to restrain power, the court delivered a reminder written into the country's original design. The guardrails are not gone. They held today. There is hope yet for the Republic. Leading off our discussion tonight is Neil Katyal. He's the former acting United States Solicitor General who argued the Trump tariff case before the Supreme Court on behalf of businesses challenging the Trump tariff policy. He is also a professor at Georgetown Law and an MS Now legal analyst. Neil, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I would say the unusual case would have been if the Supreme Court did something different, because you, as an expert on this, all the way down to somebody who's just read the Constitution and has no legal training, would have understood that Donald Trump was in over his skis with his tariffs.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I would also just say, it's really difficult to challenge a major presidential initiative in the courts. If you go back over American history, the Supreme Court maybe once or twice has struck down a president's signature initiative as being unconstitutional, but that's it. And of course, many, many people try all the time. But there's such a tradition in our court system of giving deference to the president that it almost never happens. But as you pointed out, today it did. And it is potentially a very massive moment in our history, because the Supreme Court is saying, and this is not some Democratic Supreme Court or something, 6 of the 9 justices appointed by Republican presidents. Chief Justice Roberts writes the opinion. He's appointed by President Bush. He's joined in his opinion by Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, who are both Trump appointees to the Supreme Court. And all of them are saying, with 3 other justices, so 6 of the 9 are saying, these tariffs are blatantly un-American. They're unconstitutional. That's a pretty dramatic moment.
Neil, I know when you are arguing before the Supreme Court that you need to stick to the merits of the case. You can bring in precedent, but you need to stick to this case, not all cases. Everything's not about everything with the Supreme Court. But this is monumental because the words that the Supreme Court, that the Chief Justice chose to use in the decision, do speak about presidential authority and its limits.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think what the justices were saying is that the Constitution sets out certain parameters, and if the president thinks he has some really good reason to evade them, he can't do it. because our founders said, nope, like if you really want tariffs, there's a simple thing to do. Go to Congress and get authorization for them. That's what the president tried in his first term in office. It failed. It doesn't mean you can just go around it and blow it off. And I think, it was telling that President Trump's appointee, Neil Gorsuch, at the end of his opinion, has this beautiful language about how the Constitution is what matters. And the Constitution requires that separation of powers. And yes, he says sometimes it takes time to get legislation through, but that is the American way. And so I read this decision less about tariffs, more about the constitutional system, our founders' vision, which held today. And it held today not because of the self-restraint of the president, but because a group of small businesses took the risk and said to themselves, boy, this is so illegal, I got to stand up and challenge it. And I had the privilege of representing them and speaking for them in the Supreme Court, these small businesses against the nation's most powerful man, the world's most powerful man, the president. And I wasn't speaking in some rinky-dink traffic court. I was speaking in the highest court of the land. And today the Supreme Court said, we won. That to me is what the country is about. It's not about me winning or small businesses winning. It's about the Constitution winning. Sometimes presidents are going to win those cases. Sometimes they're going to lose. But the genius of our founders, of Madison and Hamilton and others who set it up, is this idea that it's going to be debated, reasoned, argued. And boy, the justices gave me an incredibly hard time in oral argument on November 5th. But in the end, they reached a decision, and that is a decision to confine the president to the Constitution.
The decision to define the president to the Constitution. There is yet hope for the Republic. Neil, thank you for your service to the country and for joining us tonight. Joining us now, Rick Woldenberg. He's the CEO of Learning Resources. They were a lead plaintiff in the Trump tariff case. Rick, thank you for being with us. I wanted to talk to you to understand where the rubber hits the road, because for a lot of people, tariffs are an abstraction. They were not an abstraction for you. Tell us your story.
Well, they weren't an abstraction because they threatened the existence of our company. Ours is a family business. I'm third generation. The fourth generation is in the business. We're also mission driven. We make educational products for schools and homes, and hundreds of families depend on us for their livelihood. It wasn't something that we could tolerate being threatened by a politician's initiative. So we decided to stand up and defend our legacy.
Tell me how the tariffs affected your business.
Well, we spent over $10 million in 2025 on IEEPA tariffs, which caused us to pay effectively more than 100% of our net income in taxes, federal, state, and IEEPA, which is not affordable. Caused us to reduce our new products releases for the year. We had to reorganize our supply chain overnight. We cut our spending to shreds to survive the maelstrom, and we sued the president.
So one of the things that Neil Katyal just pointed out, that as obvious to some people as this decision was by the Supreme Court, it's hard to sue. It's hard to be in the Supreme Court up against the president and the administration of the United States.
Well, I'd certainly never done it before. I'm an ex-lawyer, but I was just a corporate lawyer. So this was the first time for me. I think that actually when the decision was made, I went looking for litigation in early April. The decision was it was much riskier to do nothing than to stand up for our rights. This is, after all, a claim that the law is being misapplied. It's a case in the public interest. Everyone who lives in this country has an interest in seeing the law correctly applied. But I couldn't take the risk of them destroying everything that we had created. It's too important.
You know, the Yale Budget Lab calculated that these tariffs would cost the average household about $1,700. Your governor, J.B. Pritzker, was just on with Jen Psaki talking about the fact that he wants Donald Trump to send a refund check to everybody in Illinois. When you deal with individuals, when you're a company and you deal with individuals, you saw that there was a real cost. This wasn't an abstraction. This whole business about they're going to pay more, it's not actually how tariffs work.
No, and the effect of tariffs is quite clear, too. It's a regressive tax. Since our tax rate is over 100%, we and all the other companies that pay these taxes have to pass them on or we won't survive. And the people who pay the taxes are people who spend the highest percentage of their income or their savings on things subject to tariffs. those are not billionaires. Those are everyday Americans who buy shoes and clothes and toys and power tools as a significant percentage of their earnings. The billionaires don't do that. So the tax falls on the lower end. And, that's not right. Most Americans would say a regressive tax is immoral.
Rick, thank you to people like you and other members of the business community who did decide to stand up on behalf of all of us. Rick Woldenberg, we appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
All right, coming up today, Donald Trump was defiant in his reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling. So what does the law say about other ways that he can or cannot keep imposing tariffs? The Harvard constitutional law professor Laurence Tribe joins me next. All right, today a defiant Donald Trump claimed that he could bypass the Supreme Court's decision that ruled that his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs was illegal.
The good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities, as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as President of the United States.
Apparently, Donald Trump missed when Chief Justice John Roberts said, quote, "The president's assertion here of broad statutory power over the national economy is extravagant by any measure." Here's Donald Trump's strange perversion of what the Supreme Court's ruling means for how he approaches dealing with foreign countries.
I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1. I can do anything I want to do to them, but I can't charge any money. So I'm allowed to destroy the country, but I can't charge them a little fee.
Actually, he's not allowed to destroy another country, but that's another topic. Sulking from his loss, the petulant president proceeded to impose new global tariffs under different statutes. As the Washington Post details, quote, "Those will include a 10% global tariff under Section 122, which allows the president to swiftly impose tariffs, but only for 150 days, as well as several new tariffs under Section 301, which applies to unfair trade practices." But the Supreme Court's decision made clear that Donald Trump could not impose tariffs without Congress. And here's how he responded when asked about working with Congress.
Why wouldn't you just work with Congress to come up with a plan?
I don't have to
push tariffs.
I have the
through?
right to do tariffs.
I don't know. Apparently, he just wasn't going to read that decision. Joining us now is Professor Laurence Tribe, who's taught constitutional law at Harvard Law School for 5 decades. Larry, I need you on days like this because the court was pretty clear. It was not written in hard-to-understand language, even for non-lawyers like me. Donald Trump, I don't know if he's not getting the point or he just doesn't want to get the point.
Well, in fact, to clarify just a bit more, this was not, despite what many people seem to think, it was not a constitutional controversy, believe it or not.
Yes, correct.
All 9 justices agreed that the Constitution gives only Congress the power to tax and impose tariffs. The only question is whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was an act by which Congress delegated that power to the president. The court read the act. It was a simple case, actually very simple. And it said, no, the act does not give the president any tariff imposing power. End of case. That's why most people, me included, had no trouble predicting this would be a decision against the president. It was also not so strange that the case reached the court because Neil and his client, Mr. Woldenberg, sued in a federal district court. That case ended up being dismissed by the U.S. Supreme Court, saying the district court didn't have jurisdiction. It was the Court of International Trade that had jurisdiction. That court read the law simply and said the president doesn't have the power under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. At that point, the U.S. Supreme Court had no choice but to take the case, because whenever the act of Congress is held not to cover something, and the president loses something that's central to him, the court always takes the case. Once it took the case, it was slam dunk. Now, Neil argued the case brilliantly. It was a wonderful argument, but there was no doubt how it would come out. And what is left over now that the Supreme Court has said 6-3, you don't have the power under this statute, is that he's invoking power under Section 122 of 1974 Trade Act. It is not true that the president automatically has that power. That was the suggestion by Justice Kavanaugh in dissent. The Chief Justice in footnote 4 of his opinion said, not so fast. Whether that applies depends on whether certain findings are made, and it only lasts for a certain amount of time, and it can't go above 15%. There are matters still to be litigated. And when the president says, I don't have to deal with Congress, he obviously hasn't read the law, which says you damn well better deal with Congress because your power here will expire after 150 days.
Right.
But that means that the shoe is on the other foot. And instead of having to get Congress to act to stop him, he now has to get Congress to act in order to extend these tariffs. So the president lost big on a statutory issue. There were all kinds of very valuable constitutional sort of quiverings in the opinion. The majority opinion by the Chief Justice talked about how emergency powers tend to spawn emergencies. They tend to give presidents excuses for usurping Congress. There were a lot of indications that when push comes to shove, the court will stand up for the law. And happily, the president didn't say, well, I'm not going to obey the court. What he did was he said he's going to use another law. That's fine. And then he went out of his way to call the justices, including principally his own appointees, fools, lapdogs, doing the bidding of the far left and of the rhinos. Yeah. He asserted with no evidence that the justices who voted against him were influenced by foreign nations, that they were basically traitors. I mean, this is unprecedented for a president who himself cannot plausibly deny that he is influenced by his friends and buddies, and that he's not exactly acting always in the national interest, to accuse the Supreme Court of abdicating its duty as an independent judge of the law, and to say that their families should be ashamed, which is a terrible signal in a country where their families, including the family of Amy Coney Barrett, have been threatened, have been put in danger. This president doesn't mind putting his own appointees in danger for their lives in order to make his ridiculous point that they were stupid and didn't understand the law.
I want to explore something that you just mentioned. It was a 6-3 vote. Possibly could have been a 7-2 vote if Justice Kavanaugh would come around on this. But here's something that he wrote in his dissenting opinion. He said, in essence, the court today concludes that the president checked the wrong statutory box by relying on IEEPA rather than another statute to impose these tariffs. In the meantime, however, the interim effects of the court's decision could be substantial. The United States may be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who paid the IEEPA tariffs, even though some importers may have already passed on costs to consumers or others. As was acknowledged at oral arguments, the refund process is likely to be a mess. Now, he's not wrong about that. That's true. But that's not the work of the court to determine how the government should administer the refund process. The court could have told the government, refund the money. It seemed like strange arguments.
Well, it's very strange, especially for a justice who says we look at the law and apply it. Of course, it's reasonable for justices to be pragmatic when they're interpreting an ambiguous statute to think about the consequences. But here there was no ambiguity. The president didn't have the power. And the fact that it's going to be a mess to unscramble these eggs is the president's fault, not that of the court. And in no way did Justice Kavanaugh explain the relevance of these observations. The fact is that the people who were most hurt were the consumers, and they are very unlikely to get a refund. Then the small businesses, like the one whose CEO you talked to today, maybe they'll get a partial refund. But if they end up being out some money, it's because the president, it wasn't just that he checked the wrong box. He used a statute that didn't apply. The Kavanaugh suggestion that if he had checked a different box, the same thing could have happened, that's true. All of these retaliatory taxes, these 100%, 30%, the taxes under the law he's now invoking, the 1974 Act, there's a 15% ceiling. He couldn't have done much of what he has done in this case, basically randomly using his delegated authority outside the boundaries that Congress itself set, because it didn't give him the power to impose tariffs, though he could do all kinds of other things like licensing fees.
Professor, it is helpful to hear from you tonight, because this is hard. I mean, look, I enjoy economics, but this is a lot, so I appreciate you. Harvard constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe. All right, coming up, Donald Trump will not rule out limited strikes against Iran, but he doesn't have the approval for it from Congress. Surprise, surprise. Our next guest is prepared to force a vote in the House next week on Trump's Iran war powers. Congressman Ro Khanna joins us after the break. Tonight, Donald Trump is inching closer toward military action against Iran, despite having no approval from Congress to do so. The Wall Street Journal reports that President Trump is weighing an initial limited military strike on Iran to force it to meet his demands for a nuclear deal. The opening assault, which, if authorized, could come within days, would target a few military or government sites. People familiar with the matter said, if Iran still refused to comply with Trump's directive to end its nuclear enrichment, the U.S. would respond with a broad campaign against the regime facilities, potentially aimed at toppling the Tehran regime. On Thursday, Trump said he would make a decision on strikes within the next 10 days. And when asked again today, he said this.
President, are you considering a limited military strike to pressure Iran into a deal?
Thank you, press. Keep moving. Thank you.
Are you considering a limited strike, sir?
Thank you, press.
Thank you. We're exiting out this door.
The New York Times reports the U.S. military has built up forces close to Iran, including the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, which is accompanied by 3 warships that are equipped with Tomahawk missiles that were used to strike 2 of Iran's nuclear facilities last June. The warships also carry air defenses well within striking distance of dozens of targets in Iran. Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee issued this statement. We strongly oppose preemptive U.S. military action against Iran, which endangers U.S. personnel and risks drawing Israel and Gulf partners into a wider conflict. The Constitution is clear. Decisions to go to war require congressional authorization. If the president believes military action is necessary, he must come to Congress and make the case that it is in the national security interests of the United States to do so. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna and the Republican Congressman Thomas Massie, who have worked together to great effect recently, say they are preparing to force a vote in the House of Representatives next week on Trump's war powers to strike Iran. How exactly? Well, to answer that, I'm joined by the Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. He's a member of the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you for being with us tonight. I have to say, my wag the dog antenna is up, right? Donald Trump has lost face with the Supreme Court, and I feel like he sometimes keeps these things in his back pocket. And I'm worried that if there's an attempt to attack Iran, which is a murderous, dictatorial, horrible regime, it might happen for all the wrong reasons.
Well, he's lost the trust of the American people on the Epstein matter. He has lost with the Supreme Court on tariffs. He has a big State of the Union address coming up when he knows that the economy isn't working for most working class Americans. And so he puts out this threat. The problem is that striking Iran has real consequences. It has real consequences for our troops in the area. It has real consequences for our allies. And he ran on a promise to end these wars of choice. He ran saying, we're not going to have regime change wars. And now he's betraying that promise.
Are you and Thomas Massie, what are you looking for here? Because there's value to having a debate about what should be done with Iran. As I recall, we had a deal with Iran that was working quite well until Donald Trump himself pulled us out of it, and that deteriorated matters. But this is for Congress to debate. We've got ourselves into wars in the past, you know, on false pretenses. What are you aiming for?
Well, first of all, we should have that debate, right? Even George W. Bush, who took us into Iraq, and I disagreed with the Iraq war, took that matter to Congress and got an authorization to do that from Congress. What we are saying is, if you want to strike Iran, if you want to get us into another Middle East war, then you have to come to Congress and get the votes in the House and the Senate. The second thing, though, is why are we doing this? Why aren't we spending that money on our education, on our health care, on our building up our communities and our jobs? Why are we putting, again, billions of dollars into an overseas war that has not served this country well in the past?
Well, Donald Trump would tell you, or at least he said this, he changes his tune on this a lot, but it was to protect protesters who were being attacked by their government, which I found when he said that a little bit rich, given that 2 American citizens been shot by their own government.
Look, there's no doubt that the Iranian regime has been brutal on the protesters, and I condemn it unequivocally. But what history teaches us is that our interventions don't end up making matters better. They didn't when Saddam Hussein was brutal on his own people. We got rid of him, and then what happened? We got rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and then what happened? There was a civil war. And so the question is, okay, if we go in and we try to topple this regime, first of all, it's a country of 90 million with a huge army. How many Americans are we going to lose? And what is going to come after that?
Representative Gottheimer and Lawler have made the point that to argue the war powers resolution is a sign of weakness. I fundamentally disagree with that. I mean, people say when you prosecute former presidents for doing things, it's a sign of weakness. And yet history tells you that countries that prosecuted their leaders are stronger for it. Countries that debate the right way to go into war or to attack other countries, I think are richer for it, not lesser.
I really don't understand that argument. I've challenged Representative Gottheimer and Representative Lawler to debate Thomas Massie and me. That's what we're supposed to do. But Congress is the one who gets to decide whether we get to go into war or not. Are they saying, well, let's just give the power to the president, that Congress shouldn't ever speak up? That is exactly what our founders didn't want. They didn't want a king to be going in and deciding war or peace. And I think the democratic process actually makes it stronger. And by the way, if you get Congress, that shows an extraordinary mandate. If you don't have Congress, it will show that there's not the appetite for a war.
What you and Congressman Massie are doing are really interesting stuff. You guys are bipartisan participants for the ages. I don't know that you agree on many policy issues, but you agree on what the process should be and the role that Congress should have. So we appreciate both of you working so hard on this. Thank you for joining us again tonight.
Thank you, Ali.
Congressman Ro Khanna of California. All right, coming up, Donald Trump is looking to Republicans in Congress to make it harder for Americans to vote ahead of midterm elections. But Democrats, including my next guest, are pushing back. The Arizona Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, joins me next. Seeing an increasingly likely midterm defeat on the horizon, Republicans in Congress are at it again. NPR reports a Republican voting overhaul is back on Capitol Hill. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, which is called the Save America Act, narrowly passed the House last week with all Republicans and 1 Democrat backing the bill. The overhaul would require eligible voters to provide proof of citizenship, like a valid U.S. passport or a birth certificate plus valid photo identification when registering to vote. The new iteration adds a requirement that voters also provide photo ID when casting their ballot, not just for the first time, every time. That creates problems for a lot of people. The Brennan Center for Justice notes our research shows that more than 21 million people already lack access to those documents. The SAVE Act would disenfranchise Americans of all ages and races, but younger voters and voters of color who would suffer disproportionately. Now, after passing the House, the SAVE Act does face an uphill battle in the Senate, where Republicans remain short of the 60-vote threshold there. Meanwhile, the White House is ramping up its efforts to find the so-called voter fraud that Donald Trump claims is out there somewhere. Citing sources and officials, the Washington Post reports the Justice Department has struggled to meet White House demands to prosecute non-citizen voters as conspiracy theories that President Trump and his allies have pushed in public fail to hold up legally. The Trump administration has also been pressuring states to turn over voter information, which my next guest, the Arizona Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, said last month, quote, "I'm not going to give it up." Joining us now is the Arizona Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes. Secretary Fontes, good to see you again. I want to touch on the SAVE Act for a second. You're doing stuff in Arizona that I want to get to. But just to be clear, about 48% of Americans have passports. I travel all the time. I know where my passport is all the time. 52% of Americans don't need a passport. They don't have one. It costs them money to get it. Birth certificate. Couldn't really tell you where mine is at the moment. I'm not even sure what my naturalization certificate is, because we're not in a country that causes us to need these things, right? You need to know your social security number and you need to have your driver's license. We're not a country built for this imposition of documentation that they're looking for.
Yeah, we're not supposed to be. But if some folks got their way, we would be, because apparently signing an affidavit under penalty of perjury that you are a U.S. citizen isn't enough for some folks.
Which is what it is. I just want to remember that is punishable by law. If you lie about your eligibility to vote, it's punishable. In many states, when they find non-citizens, it's infinitesimal, the number, they prosecute them.
Yeah, not only do we prosecute folks for being non-citizens and voting or attempting to vote, but we prosecute folks for a bunch of other things. In fact, just last month in January, I sent 28 cases to our Attorney General for prosecution for either double voting here in Arizona, voting out of state, someone using somebody else's voter registration who may have been passed away. Look, the bottom line is this. We maintain our voter rolls very, very well. And if we could use the ERIC system nationally, which is where we got all of this information from, we could do a better job. But this idea in this SAVE Act about documentation and photo ID, it all stems originally from a lie. And if it were to go into place, let's talk about older Americans, older American women who, for example, may have been married a long time ago, and who knows where your birth certificate or your marriage certificate is. I mean, I don't know too many people who keep track of that. And what if you're from one of those parishes in southern Louisiana or some other place like Lahaina or another community whose records were destroyed because of natural disasters or something like that? You suddenly don't get to vote because, the good Lord willed it. I mean, that's not how this is supposed to work. And it's insane to me that all of this is based on a lie. And in your opening, you pointed out very clearly, they're frustrated because they can't find any of the folks they say there are millions of. And as the chief election officer here in Arizona, I'd like to see the list of people who you say are voting illegally in this state, because I want to take them off the list. So, hey, Secretary Noem and Mr. President, send me the list of names that we can fix our rolls with. Let's be partners, not scare people into thinking that we need to lock down some sort of a system that frankly already works pretty well for everybody.
Yeah, I think in Michigan they had 16 people, of which they're prosecuting 13 out of 6 million. I think Georgia had 8. Maintaining your election system should not be on autopilot. And one thing I like talking to you about, it's not on autopilot. You're constantly doing stuff. In fact, you're currently doing stuff right now. You need to update machines. You need to update all sorts of things. That's what happens. Donald Trump would have you believe that you're just working out of an old phone book or something.
Well, maybe he's working out of an old phone book, but we use technology that, frankly, here in Arizona is a little bit old and it needs updating. But across the country, folks are doing the work every single day. Think about this. At every MVD across the United States of America, people are registering to vote every single day. These are dynamic lists. The stuff changes and it has to be updated. And we have to make sure every single day that our election systems writ large are in place. Now, we can't help it that most people people just notice elections administrators around election time, and that's okay, because we shouldn't be the main focus of what people are thinking about. They should take care of their homes and their families and their communities. But the bottom line is this: without the kinds of resources that we need to keep these systems updated and keep things moving along, we're going to have significant problems. But at the end of the day, we're not getting the resources that we need, particularly here in Arizona, from our Republican legislature. And that's why we've proposed one of the things that you talked about a little bit in your opening is the Arizona Voters First Act, which would put money into our systems to make sure that we can shore them up and have healthy and robust systems to, I don't know, maintain the voter rolls, keep security in our IT systems, give access to voters, like returning the permanent early vote list. And it's really ironic where you have 80% of Arizona's voters voting by mail. And just the other day, on a 17-13 partisan vote, our good friends on the other side of the aisle voted for a measure that would kill ballot by mail voting in Arizona completely.
This is wild.
It's just insane. And I don't know where they're getting their information that this is popular from, because it's not. And look, it was invented. Mail-in voting was created in Arizona by Republicans.
You guys are good at it. It's
We're
really good at it. It's just it's kind of like non-citizen voting. It's not a problem.
Here's the other thing, Ali, and it's crazy to me. Like, okay, let's assume for a minute you decide we're going to kill mail-in balloting. 80% of your voters now need somewhere to vote. Who's going to pay for the equipment? Who's going to hire all of those people? Are these cheapskates going to put money into a system that they've been starving for years all of a sudden to meet up with this goal? No, they're not. So, like, it's just unrealistic from a fiscal perspective. It's unrealistic from an access perspective. It doesn't help from a security perspective. And in the first place, it's all based on nonsense. So it just doesn't work. And I think the American voters are sick and tired of this nonsense.
Yeah, I think you're right. Adrian Fontes, good to talk to you. Thank you again for being with us.